Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to Reconciliation for Western Sydney's Building Bridges second session. Tonight, we'll be listening to Lydia Thorpe, and she's being a newly elected member of the Senate. She's a former Victorian parliamentarian, and perhaps you'll, I've just lost my track, but I'd like to welcome Lydia especially, who's been happy to come and talk to us tonight through the Zoom channels and help build our knowledge. I'd also like to welcome everyone who's able to tune in tonight and be a part of our Building Bridges second session. First, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. We wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. Now, for me, it's the Darug and Guringai people. And I'd like to pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and commit ourselves to work together for reconciliation. Firstly, I should introduce myself. My name is Jonathan Atkin, and I've been a part of Building Bridges for only a few years. I've always thought very strongly about reconciliation. However, my role as a teacher and my family responsibilities have perhaps held me back. But I've been involved for 2 years, a bit longer than 2 years, and I've enjoyed every moment. I've learned so much from being involved in building bridges. My story started formally when I marched across the bridge more than 20 years ago, and I was thinking that the ball of reconciliation was well and truly rolling. And in the years following, I've seen the politicians and miners and many other organisations seeming to do their best to hold things up. And so it's great now for me to have found an organisation like Building Bridges where I can help foster the development of reconciliation. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Lydia Thorpe. Lydia is a Gunnai and Gunditjmara woman. She's the first woman in the Victorian State Parliament and the first Aboriginal Senator for Victoria. Lydia is an activist and strong advocate for clans-based treaties. I'd like to hand it over to Lydia and thank her very much again.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Building Bridges, for inviting me to speak tonight. It actually brings back memories from when I was a kid with the Building Bridges concerts back then. I think that was in the 80s, and I think the Crowded House brothers were a part of that in those days with my uncle Robbie Thorpe. So it's, you know, it's an old term that I haven't heard for a while. So it's good to see we're still building bridges somewhere. And just, Jonathan, your introduction, thank you for that. I also walked across the bridge in Sydney at that time with my mum. I was heavily pregnant with my now, what is she? She's 20 in 2 weeks. So yeah, it was 20 years ago, and I think you know, as big as the momentum was 20 years ago, and how we thought that ball was well and truly rolling, I think what we have to face up to is that this country was just too racist at the time to reconcile, and I think 20 years later, we've come a long way, but we've also gone back a long way, and it's time now as a nation that we decide, in fact, which way are we going to go. So before I get into that, I do want to also acknowledge that I'm on stolen land. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. In fact, I just moved house yesterday. So I'm on my phone. I don't have my internet connected yet. So, you know, high tech, I'm not a big fan of that. But as long as you can hear me and see me, I'm good. So, yeah, the reconciliation movement, my mum was on the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation with John Howard and Linda Burney and Pat Dodson, Sir Gus Nozzle. I remember having dinner at John Howard's house, in fact, and being stranded at his house because I think my son would have been about 8 or 9. He wanted to get John Howard's autograph. And I said, no way are you doing that. Come on, let's just get on this bus and go back to the hotel. And I had Arnie Beryl Booth there as well. And she said, no, you have to let your boy get the Prime Minister's autograph. So instead of walking towards the bus, we started walking back to Kirribilli House, and the bus with Ray Martin and Sir Gus Nozzle and all the VIPs left without that. How could they even not know that the Thorpes weren't on that bus? But they left without us, and we got stranded at John Howard's house. And my son got his autograph. John Howard was in a rush to get off to the rugby, so he went off and he said, "You'll be right with my wife Janet, and we'll get the cook to drive you back to your hotel." So that's what happened. And my little sister, who is now in her mid-30s and part of the Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance, she would have been probably about 11 at the time. She said to Mum and I on that bus heading to Kirribilli House, "Can I ask John Howard why he won't say sorry to the stolen generation?" And Mum and I just said, no, you can't, we've got to be polite and we can't ask questions, political questions. So when she first met John Howard, the first thing she said was, "Why won't you say sorry to the stolen generation?" Because she didn't listen to us. She wanted to ask the question. And this is a, 11, 12-year-old at the time, and now heading up some pretty impressive Black Lives Matter rallies and Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance rallies, particularly in Victoria. So I'm here to talk about treaty, and I think, everything I talk about relates to treaty, whether it be climate change, whether it be freeing our people who are seeking asylum in this country. It touches on every aspect of what this country is about. And I have grown up in a political family, and we've always talked about treaty. Treaty is something that we've always strived for, and that's been happening from very early on with our activists. And that's a legacy I've always known to continue to fight for, because at the end of the day, a treaty is about peace. It's about negotiating a way through that we can peacefully live in this country together. And I am strong about that because I have been around this country. I've seen our people fighting for country, fighting for their own very survival, because they're living still in third world conditions in this country, in this, what they say is the lucky country. We have people so poor that, it's affecting whole communities and whole families. We have people dying in custody, we have people incarcerated, we still have our children taken away, more so than the stolen generation itself. So it seems that the war hasn't ended on Aboriginal people in this country. It started over 240 years ago, and today we are still fighting this war, right? But it's just more of a sophisticated method that's being used, and that is policies and legislation that continues to oppress Aboriginal people in this country. So a treaty to me is about equal negotiation. It's about being able to sit at the table and talk about how we can live in this country peacefully together. It means that we will have to give some things up that we care about, but it also means that the government has to give up some of their power and control. And I think that at the end of the day, a treaty is going to benefit not just First People, but it will benefit every Australian. It will benefit every person in this country in a way that their land and their water is preserved and protected how it has been for thousands of generations. It talks about, it's a way that non-Aboriginal people can learn about our culture, and that is the value of elders and how, we treat our elders as royalty. And you look at how this government, or state and federal governments are talking about our elders in aged care facilities, they just keep passing the buck to one another. So we need to be able to have conversations where we're learning from one another, and that we're, talking truth about the area that you live in, and dispossession, the genocide that happened in this country, and the massacres that happened. That's just not in our written history, and it's not acknowledged, and that's painful for us to be able to reconcile or wave the Australian flag or sing the Australian anthem, because we feel we are still at war. And the only thing that will end this war is a treaty. And a treaty will take some time, but it's about the journey and not the destination. And I think that we can get a lot of early quick wins through a well-meaning, a good faith treaty with this government. And that is protection of land, so that, native title is not land rights. So the destruction that native title has created around this country for Aboriginal people is just, we can't even measure that. I mean, it's just such a painful process for so many families. So, we need to talk about real land rights, and land rights that gives back land to Aboriginal people, its rightful owners, to be able to preserve and protect. I mean, it's not that we're going to take back land and say, we're going to dig it up and make money from it and no one can touch it. The land that we want to protect and preserve is for you. It's for everybody to enjoy for future generations. So that's just one element. I mean, I'm not going to put on the table what a treaty will absolutely include. I think that needs to be self-determined by the clans and nations around this country. They know who they are. They know who their spokespeople are. They know who their elders are. And rather than have hand-picked self-appointed leaders making decisions for us all the time, which we know both, all consecutive governments have done, they've hand-picked self-appointed leaders. They're not our leaders. The leaders of our people are the people in their own communities, their own elders, their own lawmen, we all have a different role within our clan group. And it's just like you with your family. You know how your family operate. You know who speaks the loudest in your family. You know who does all right in your family. You know who the elder is, who has the authority to speak in your family. It's no different. So we should be given the same rights to be able to self-determine what is best for us. And that's where I think a treaty is the answer. In terms of the state and territory treaty conversations that are happening right now, I think, you know, good on those. They're basically 3 Labor governments that have started these conversations in Queensland, the Northern Territory and Victoria. The Victorian conversations started around 4 years ago. We were given maps of Crown land that was available around Victoria, so it was quite exciting to think, wow, you know, we can negotiate getting some land back. We can negotiate the end to child removals. We can negotiate the end to destruction of land and water, and start negotiating what Crown land is left. But in the last 3 years, the same government who wants to talk about a treaty in good faith is selling Crown land like it's you know, it's a fire sale of Crown land. Logging continues right across our country in Victoria, particularly on Gunnai country, my own country. And we're talking illegal logging. We're talking about totems becoming extinct or on the extinction list. And we're talking about, you know, the continued mass incarceration of Aboriginal people, particularly women, where it's gone up over 400% in Victoria, Aboriginal women incarcerated. So I find it really hard to be able to sit at a table and negotiate with a government who is continuing to violate our rights as Indigenous people of this country. So if that's what a treaty looks like for Victoria and Queensland and the Northern Territory, Queensland, they extinguished native title of the Wanganjangaloo people and, you know, made way for the Adani coal mine whilst they're talking treaty. Then you go to the Northern Territory, they lift the moratorium on fracking whilst they're talking about treaty. So if that is a treaty, then I don't want it. That is not genuine. And there has to be some good faith given so that we want to participate. Otherwise, we're just being treated like we always have, and that is, you know, stay on welfare, no economic empowerment of our people, and no free, prior and informed consent of our people. So the whole rights in terms of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, they're out the door. And that's certainly the case in the Victorian context, where I was a parliamentarian at the time and negotiated some of that, that legislation. And one of the things that I fought very hard for was to have the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People into the body of that piece of legislation, the treaty legislation in Victoria. And that was denied. That was denied by the Labor government to have the declaration in the body. So they put it in the preamble, which is by and by, you know, it doesn't have as much teeth. And the other thing that I fought for in the Victorian context whilst I was there was that the Victorian government acknowledged that we are the sovereign people of these lands, and they could not do that. And that went to a vote in Parliament, and only the 3 Greens, and I was one of those, stood up and agreed to the government acknowledging our sovereignty, whilst every other MP in that place voted it down. So if we're going to start with that kind of good faith, then I don't think it's worth going down that path. So we need to educate, we need to inform, we need to have as many conversations as we possibly can about a treaty in this country and what that looks like. It doesn't look like what you're seeing in the states and territories. The assembly that was established in Victoria is another good example of no free, prior and informed consent, where the the treaty commissioner with the government decided that you had to be a recognised government entity or Aboriginal corporation to be able to sit around the table and represent your country, or you had to go to a vote. And the vote that they went through to fill the rest of the seats on that assembly only had 7% participation. So that means 93% of Aboriginal people who live in Victoria did not participate and put themselves on the Aboriginal role that was established through the Victorian Treaty process. So if we have 97% of Aboriginal people in this country that don't want to participate in a treaty, then I will accept that, and we can go down another path. But I think in the Victorian context, to think that that's okay, I'm concerned about that as well. And I suppose that takes me to the Uluru Statement and constitutional recognition. Again, it's I would estimate, not even 90% of Aboriginal people around this country want to be put in the Australian Constitution. I wouldn't say 90% of Aboriginal people want a treaty either, but I can guarantee you that Aboriginal people in this country do not want to be put into that Constitution until such time as we have some kind of real settlement in this country, and that's via a treaty. So I won't go into the Uluru stuff, but I think that all I can say about that is, in terms of the statement, I think that it's a well written and well-meaning statement. But my position is that we need truth-telling first and foremost. This country needs to educate itself. It needs to mature as a nation and know what this country's real history is. So that includes the frontier wars, the massacres, all the things that I've mentioned. And then we need to go down a treaty conversation, just like we did 20 years ago. Why can't we do that again? Because we have come some way, and I think the general Australian population has come a way where we can have that roadmap to reconciliation brought back, we can have that toolkit brought back, but have it in a treaty context. And, back in the 90s, the ATSIC developed a number of treaty resources. I think that we can mesh that together and give people information to have a conversation. And that has not happened since that reconciliation movement 20 years ago. So as bad as the government was back then, I do give them credit for that reconciliation consultation, which reached far and wide and was at the local government level with local communities. So I'd like to see that happen with a national treaty process, with that information, with workshops in local communities. And I just believe that if people want to voice to Parliament, an advisory body to Parliament, then that can be negotiated in a treaty process. But what we can also negotiate in a treaty is seats in Parliament, not a voice to. I think we would have more, more power by having a seat in that place rather than advising it on the outside, because we all know that when you're an advisory committee, you just, people can decide to take your advice or not to take your advice. Whereas when you have a seat in Parliament, you are a vote. I wouldn't like to see those dedicated seats be aligned to any party. I see that, the Waitangi Treaty has seats dedicated in Parliament for Māori people, but they are party aligned. And I've been talking to them fellas over there, and they said that it's dangerous because, they've all jumped onto them, or the majority have jumped onto one party. So that's a conversation that needs to be had in local communities on how we can make sure that it is an independent First Nations voice. And yeah, I just think that we'd get a lot more out of that than we would any way forward. You know, we're sick of being at war. We're sick of being the poorest people in our own country, the sickest people in our own country, and we want peace. And I think this pandemic has really highlighted the, you know, the inequalities that exist in this country. And I do think that a treaty can address that as well. It's not just about us, it's about also addressing these inequalities that this country allows to continue, some of the human rights violations that this country allows to continue. If we have power in this country, then we could have a say on those other injustices that affect so many other people. And of course, climate change. You know, we need to be a strong voice there. We've maintained and protected these lands for thousands and thousands of generations. We have solutions to this problem that we're facing, but we don't get a seat at the table. I was at the World Climate Negotiations last year in Madrid, and I was the only Aboriginal woman from Australia at that negotiation. I got to negotiate with the New Zealand government and the Australian government on having the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People put into the Paris Agreement. But I was one voice, and the USA and a couple of other countries didn't allow the UNDRIP to go into the Paris Agreement. But the more we have a seat at the table, the more we're able to influence and negotiate better outcomes for all of us. So I'm going to stop there because I'm getting to become a seasoned politician and can bore you with talking at you. I just want to do a little shout out to Klaus and Cheryl, who I can see there with the Aboriginal flag in the background. So very big supporters, and they feel like they're like my elders as well, my non-Aboriginal elders who've just been part of the resistance and the fight for so long. So thank you again for having me, and I'll throw it over to you all now to fire some questions at me that I hope I can answer.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia, so much for that. You've given us lots to think about, and also lots to hope for. And we wish you all the best in your term in the Senate. It's going to be wonderful. But now there are some questions that are being posted on the chat, so I'll be able to read them out to you. And the first one was firstly by Ian, and it was an important question too. What was John Howard's answer to your sister's question?
Oh, I'm sorry, it's a really boring answer. He said, it's not me, it's my government.
Ah.
So, and Mum and I just kind of ushered her away because she would have just like tagged on his jumper the whole night otherwise. But yeah, it was a very boring answer, and he quickly, shuffled off anyhow. So yeah, sorry. Yeah. Nothing exciting.
It's what we could expect, perhaps, from John Howard. Now, Denise, to everyone, said people are dying on the streets. Has anyone examined prototypes of treaties in other countries with other First Nations people? And how many have been broken, regardless of standing treaty to begin with? Shouldn't there be a national treaty to get the ball rolling on individual clans?
That's a very good question. Thank you. Yes, treaties are broken all the time, and we have to learn from treaties around the world, and that's where, we can't go into this lightly. We have to learn from those other treaties, and throughout this process, we've made a lot of good connections with First people in those countries. But we have a blank canvas here You know, why can't we strive for the best treaty? Why can't we strive for a new national identity that everyone agrees with and you know, is happy to live with going forward? So I just see this as an opportunity, and after, you know, if we go through a process like we did in the reconciliation one and spoken to every clan and nation and local government areas, you know, non-Aboriginal communities, if we can come up with a treaty that people will agree with, then that's fine. But if we come up with a treaty that people don't agree with, that's okay too, because we still have the right to agree to or not to agree to a treaty at the end of the day. I mean, it's a negotiation, right? So if you're not happy with what's being put on the table, you can't just accept the status quo. It can't be like it is. We cannot accept how we are living in this country today. So do we agree with a treaty that makes matters worse for us? Or do we agree with a treaty that's going to benefit us and everybody else in this country, but get us out of poverty and allow us some economic benefit? I mean, how much land has been stolen, how much resources have been stolen from these lands that we've never talked about? You know, I asked somebody to try and give me a figure on all the stolen land and resources, and they looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, well, that's a figure, right? That's what's been stolen. No one's ever been held accountable. So do we start with a figure and then work back from that? So it has to be up to the clans and nations, absolutely. Yeah. And then if everyone agrees with some principles like the, you know, stop deaths in custody, we have to change some laws around what's increasing our incarceration rates, implement the remainder of the recommendations from the Royal Commissions. We can have a whole list of things that they have promised to do for decades and say, all right, if you just do all these things, then yeah, we'll sit down and negotiate. We have the power here. We are sovereign.
Yeah. And this, thank you. And this follows another comment from Lisa. It would be great to understand more about the specifics of the treaty that is being proposed so we can discuss it with friends and family and why it's necessary and a good thing. And
yeah, and I suppose I resist from talking about the detail because it has to be up to clans and nations. And for me to write a, you know, talk about a list of things, then that may not be acceptable for my neighbouring clan or the mob in, you know, up north or west. So my priority personally for my people, my family, my clan is stop logging our country, remove the power station in the Latrobe Valley because it's killing my people, it's killing our water. Our babies are being born very, very small. Give our people an opportunity to economic develop and empower themselves in Gippsland, where, you know, we're a very big population there. We don't have the same opportunities as everybody else for employment because of racism. And other reasons, and reparate. You know, a lot of our people are people who've come out of the stolen generation. You know, their families have never been the same. You can never recover from being stolen, and that impact on generations is real. And so we need reparations. I don't know what that looks like. It's up to that, you know, people of the stolen gen to negotiate that. But we've got to stop this destruction of land and water and our people. And I suppose they're top of my mind. And then we can talk about what other clans and nations want. their priorities will differ to ours on Gunnai country and Gunditjmara country. I mean, we've got rock art at Garryword, which is what the colonisers called the Grampians. And, that's being destroyed. So we want some control over our own land and decision making, and we want to economically benefit from what comes from our land, not these overseas companies that come in and rip the guts out of our land and blow Juukan Gorge up and things like that. We should have a say in what's going on in our own country.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that. Now, I have another question from Georgina Gatlin. And could Lydia please speak of Gary Murray's and the Victorian Traditional Owners Land Justice Group extensive work on clans-based treaties?
Yeah, so I worked voluntarily with the Victorian Traditional Owner Land Justice Group, and Gary Murray has been a great mentor of mine, and he's done incredible work in identifying that we had over 300 clans in Victoria. We only have just over 100 left. So 200 clans, or just under 200 clans, have been wiped off the face of the earth, annihilated by colonisation. Now that's a lot of clans. That's family clan groups. So, we need to acknowledge that we have 300 clans. We need to identify, well, Gary's done that with his work. He's identified which ones have been wiped out. That needs to be known. That needs to be part of our history in Victoria. And with the 100 surviving clans, there are elders that represent each of those 100, just over 100 surviving clans. They should be the elders that are the authority to any treaty in this state. And of the 300 clans, there are 38 nations, so 38 distinct language groups. And the 38 nations are who should be around the treaty table. But that hasn't happened. Only 12 of the nations have been selected to go around the table, and then the rest was put to a vote. And that's why it's not working. So the work that Gary's done is produce a booklet of those clans with the mapping areas of where where their country is, and some beautiful old ancestral photos that go along with that. Now that book is more of a work in progress, so that clans and nations can identify the boundaries and make any grammatical corrections in the booklet. But it's the only resource or tool that's been made from a non-incorporated grassroots sovereign body, which is the Victorian Traditional Owner Land Justice Group. They have no funding, and yet they were able to produce this incredible book, which I suggest you all try and get a hold of. But yeah, that's what we need to do right across this country. And that was done by Aboriginal people for Aboriginal people. And if we duplicated that around the country, then that clearly articulates who we need to be doing treaties with.
Thank you so much for that. Now, our next question is from Nita Alexander. How would a treaty differ from the Uluru Statement from the Heart? Could the statement be a starting point for treaty negotiations?
Absolutely. I think it would complement the Uluru Statement. But at the same time, we have to be very careful about going into the Australian Constitution, and that's what the Uluru Statement calls for. So that, in terms of priority, should be last, because if we go into, so we're in a colonial project, right? We're part of this colonial project. The colonisers came from England and they set up their colony here, and they put this law onto us, which is, the Australian Constitution in 1901, over the oldest living continuing culture in the world that has been here for thousands and thousands of generations. So to think that we would want to go into the Australian Constitution before we have a treaty just doesn't make sense. So I think it can complement a treaty process as long as we don't jump the gun and call for a referendum on a voice to Parliament and an enshrined voice, which means, you know, who knows what that means. Will it mean that the voice is going to fight for a treaty for us? Who picks the voice? What does the voice look like? How much power do they have? I'd rather spend my time and taxpayers' money on a treaty conversation rather than a referendum to have another advisory body.
Yeah, that's very worthwhile listening to that, Lydia. Let me just first say, I imagine this is, I imagine that, you know, like Senate estimates will be a breeze for you.
Can't wait.
Well, I can't wait to see you there. The next question to Ian again is, how do you see the role of voice and truth-telling in this process of treaty? Which comes first?
We have to have truth-telling. This country has an identity crisis.
Yeah.
It has a mental health problem because it doesn't acknowledge that it is sick and that it doesn't know what its culture is. It wheels us in for a welcome to country and then you know, sets up a Northern Territory intervention or incarcerates our people at the rate that they do, but want to be all warm and fluffy about a welcome to country, or is it the AFL and the footy and the meat pie and a beer? Like what who are we as a nation? What do we represent? When someone says to you, you know, what is your country about? You can't say it's about us because we're not even at the table. And, you know, people talk about this country in such a positive light because they have no idea what's actually going on here. And so truth-telling is so very important for this country to mature as a nation and try and get, you know, this education through every level of our education system, from 5-year-old, 4-year-old children right through to mature age university students. We need it at every level because the truth has been denied for so long, and that's why we have the problem we have today with racism, systemic racism, and, you know, we're bottom of the rung. And I've heard that from people only recently that, you know, they always thought that Aboriginal people were just the bottom of the rung in this country. And when you hear that from somebody who's just, you know, only been in the country for 5 years, she was absolutely horrified after she'd met me and thought, that's, you know, I'm just so sorry that I had that kind of thinking. But that's how a lot of people think in this country, and we have to turn that around. And we need not to be seen as a threat or a problem or an issue. We need to be seen as part of the solution that will make this country better for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. So, now Lester asked, is a treaty likely to be completed and signed in the next 20 years? Is it a doable task? Well, with Lydia in the Senate, it'll be easier.
I keep asking myself that question too, because, you know, my first protest, or, you know, I've been protesting since I was 5. My youngest grandchild is 5. And I just always ask myself, you know, what kind of a future am I leaving for her? And I think 20 years is doable. I think it's absolutely doable. I think that we could see it in my time. I'll be an elder by then, hopefully. So I do think it can happen in 20 years. I don't think it can happen in 10, but I think 20 years. I mean, you know, the reconciliation movement was 20 years ago. Uncle Rob always says it's 2020 vision. This is our 2020 vision, and we can get there in 20 years. Absolutely.
Yeah. Lydia, do you have any definite goals in your time in the Senate? Things that you're aiming to achieve?
Yep. So as long as I get past the next election, because in Victoria I only did 12 months and I had all these, grand ideas. I only got to accomplish a few of them. But yeah, so the next election will be called probably soon. And I expect that to happen end of next year. So that will only give me the 12 months. But in the time that I have, and with the portfolios I have, I want to put treaty well and truly on the table. So that is my First Nations priority. My justice priority is to raise the age of criminal responsibility. We're locking up all Australian children from the age of 10, every state and territory. The ACT have just announced that they'll raise the age to 14, but we need to pressure every other state and territory to do the same. If they did that tomorrow, we would see 600 children released from prisons from the age of 10 to 14. So that's certainly a priority. And the other area is, there's other two, is deaths in custody. I'll be running a strong campaign on getting the remainder of those recommendations implemented from the 1991 Royal Commission into deaths in custody. I'll be asking a lot of questions around that. In fact, I had a motion ready last week and I didn't get it up because the government and the opposition were playing games. So we didn't get a few motions across that we'd like to. But I went in with that message stick with 441 markings representing each of the people who have died at the hands of this system. And so I meant that, and I will continue to fight for that. And also changing some of the legislation that's been discriminatory for too long, that's led to the mass incarceration of Aboriginal people. We need to see social reinvestment, justice reinvestment. We're wasting taxpayers' money by locking people up. That money needs to be redirected back into community for them to self-determine what works for them. They have the solutions, but they have no resources. They're living in poverty. They're dealing with the same system that discriminates. So if we change some of those laws, I can see, that our people will have a better chance. So they're my main priorities. I also have the sports portfolio, and I'm very passionate about sport, and I'm a keen sportswoman. And one of the things that I found in my sporting career and my children's sporting time is that racism is real, and that the inequality and the accessibility to sport, around the country. Why should poor people have to only have a few choices of sports? Why can't we play tennis, and why can't we do gymnastics? Why do they have to be so highly priced? And it seems like there's sports for the elite or the rich and the privileged, and there's sports for the less fortunate. So I'd like to see all sports being available to all people.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question here from Maria Maguire. It's yes, she says, yes, treaty, of course, essential for all, yet the how is the big question. Do you see any option but bottom up, that is local level of clans and local government, regions, state, so I've lost the state level of clans and local government, regions, state level, up to and up more and more.
Yep. So it cannot be a top-down approach. It does not work. It has to come from the grassroots level, at the local government level, at the clans level. And if you're part of the reconciliation process 20 years ago, that's how that worked. It was at the absolute grassroots level. And so they're the conversations we need to be having, and then we can collectively put pressure on the government to have a more formal process. And but we need to hear from the people what they want, what's going to work, say in Lakes Entrance, where I used to live, which is a very hard place to live when you're a black person. But what is going to work for that community to come together so that that inequality doesn't exist, and that the destruction of the land doesn't happen anymore? How can that community come together and have meaningful, respectful conversation about how they can move forward together? And that's going to take some time, but I think if we have that toolkit like we did with the reconciliation process, then that will help guide people through a conversation that pulls out the priorities for those communities. And if we look at the reconciliation process, the priority back then 20 years ago was treaty. Now, for some reason, somewhere along the line, that got tipped on its head, and we've seen the Recognise campaign, the You Me Unity campaign, which is also about going into the Constitution, and now the Uluru Statement. So there's been 3 attempts over time to put us into the Constitution, even though the reconciliation process came out and said clearly, treaty, we need a treaty. That is a priority. That's what people have said.
Yeah, thank you. This is from Jens Korf. Do you have advice for allies who help with the truth-telling by writing about Aboriginal culture?
I think it's not about Aboriginal culture. I think it's more about truth-telling in a context from a ally's perspective, and what you want to, because we've been saying it for 240 years and still no one's listening. But when you have influence amongst your peers, that can make more of a difference than using our culture or our language. It's using your language to educate your people on why this is so important. So I think any writings about Aboriginal culture should come from Aboriginal people. But in a political context, I think that non-Aboriginal people can articulate this just as well from your perspective. It's got to come from your heart as well, in terms of why you want this. Why will it make it better in your life to have a treaty in this country? Why is it important for you? And I think when people start hearing that, then we might change some more minds.
Yeah. And from Maria Maguire, again, she said, what would stepping stones towards treaty look like, such as 5-year goals for 20 years?
I haven't stepped it out yet. But I suppose, just getting to where I have to even raise the profile of what our people have been calling for is one big step, I think. But I think that, we're going to be facing an election soon. We can put pressure on both of the bigger parties to start having the conversation and put it on their policy platform to have a treaty. I know that you might find it difficult with the LNP, but certainly Labor are willing to entertain it. But they're obviously also supporting a voice to Parliament and a constitutional recognition. So we need to be having conversations with them about making it their priority. I think, you know, if we have a change of government, then and they supported it, then we could start very, very soon after that election and start those, go back to that reconciliation model and rejig that. I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel every single time. There's some good work that's happened over decades, good information out there. We just need to bring that together and have those local government, town hall, clan-based, nation-based conversations. And I think that could take probably, you know, 2 years to do. And then in 5 years, we could have the bones of, or the, you know, a framework that we could maybe take to the rest of the nation and say, this is what we've been talking about. These are the priorities that have come out of it, and we want to make this a formality and have a treaty enshrined in the Constitution that will ensure that the government are held accountable through their own law book.
Yeah. I'm scrolling down. There's been, I should mention, Lydia, this is the first time I've ever hosted a meeting, and it's been a remarkable experience for me, and I've enjoyed it immensely. Though I was, you know, I was in great trepidation through this, but it's been a wonderful evening, and the responses on the chat line have been.
Have we lost Jonathan? He was doing so well. Okay, so maybe I just keep talking. I can't see the chat, but hopefully Jonathan will come back in shortly. Did someone have a question that hasn't been answered? I'm going to go to Kleben. You have to unmute. You have to unmute.
There's another question that said the statement says constitutional reform, it doesn't mention referendum. I'm not sure how there could be a reform without a referendum. So I'd like to hear their views on that.
What was the first part of that question?
The statement says constitutional reform, it doesn't mention referendum. I'm not sure how there could be a reform without a referendum. So I'd like to hear their views on that.
Yeah, so any change to the Australian Constitution requires a referendum, and that's the risk that we would be taking. And, you know, when you don't have, Aboriginal people are not one homogenous group. We don't all think the same, we don't all look the same, we all have differing views. And so I know that a lot of Aboriginal people will protest against a referendum for any inclusion into the Australian Constitution. And so to go down the path of a referendum, I think will do more harm than good at this point in time, because we have also the very conservative parties such as the One Nation Party, Pauline Hanson, who also doesn't want Aboriginal people to be included into the Australian Constitution. So it would be pretty sad to see, you know, Black activists marching beside Pauline Hanson for the same thing. I think it'd be quite remarkable, actually. I don't think they'd be marching together. They'd be marching separately, but and for different reasons. So I suppose just to answer your question, any change to the Constitution, including acknowledging we exist, still requires a referendum. And whereas a treaty does not require a referendum, it's something that the government can decide to do.
Okay, next question. Establishing a treaty is a very long and complicated process, but also very important. Where do you think the resources will come from to do so from MOB's perspective?
From MOB's perspective, was it the last bit?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, it is. So is incarcerating our people. So is taking our children away. So is going to a referendum on something that not all Aboriginal people agree to. So we can, we can talk about the cost. I think this will save this country money by going down this path rather than cost more. I think it's a conversation that's well overdue. I think that we've been very patient in the last 240 years and quite conciliatory in how we operate as a people on our land, despite the atrocities that have occurred against us. So I think, the money is there. There's a lot of stolen wealth that this country has created on the backs of our people. The least they can do is put some money towards a process that will unite this country and give it an identity that we can all be proud of.
Lydia, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, good. I'm sorry, the plug pulled out of the computer I'm on. I'm just hoping to find the questions because it started. When I looked on when I was on the chat line, there were some questions.
I've just asked.
Yeah, it's from Lisa.
Yep.
I've got the treaty from Lisa to everyone. Is the treaty that you speak of aligned with the treaty that will form part of the Uluru Statement? I'm trying to understand if you support it or if it is another colonial project or virtue signalling that is being seen to be doing something. I wondered how the delegates were chosen at the convention in 2017 that decided on its content, and if there was any outside influence, so to speak. It will be confusing and perhaps pose a greater challenge if there are two factions. I guess very much I'd like to show my support.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The way the delegates were...
I'm sorry, Lydia, to show my support and solidarity, and I'm not sure where and how to do that. Welcome. Sorry.
That's okay. So there were a number of dialogues that went around the country with the Referendum Council visiting regional cities mainly. There was an invite-only email that went out to Aboriginal organisations and Aboriginal corporations. I attended the Sydney dialogue before the Melbourne one because I wanted to get a feel for how things were going to be run. I was immediately told when I arrived at the Sydney dialogue in Blacktown that there was a number of people excluded from that meeting. There were protests outside. An elder got arrested and put in the back of a divvy wagon. There was a fire lit outside of the event where the fire brigade came and put that out. It was quite a scene and it was not very nice. I went inside as an observer, and basically the agenda was set. There were 5 areas that needed to be talked about, and they were all related to how we were either going to go into the Constitution or how we were going to change the existing Constitution. There was no discussion or no opportunity to talk about anything else, including treaty. So the agenda was set. and the invites were very clear on you know, I think locking grassroots people out, because that's the majority that were outside. When they came to Victoria, we had obviously the heads up on how that was going to be run. And we, because of Gary Murray's work and the work that we talked about earlier tonight, we as the Land Justice Group were, or still are, an advocacy body for all of the clans and nations in Victoria. And so we negotiated with the Referendum Council and said, well, because we represent 38 nations and 300 clans or 100 clans, we have to invite those. And so we did, and we had a lot of grassroots people in the Victorian dialogue. Now, because we had the numbers in the room, we also put a 6th agenda item on the table, which was rejected at first, but then it was accepted because we had the numbers. And that 6th agenda item was how this would affect our sovereignty as a people. And the idea was to break up into the 5 groups. So in our case, it was 6 groups, and only 4 people walked out of the room to the other 5 workshops. Everyone else stayed in and wanted to know how this was going to affect our sovereignty. And so the Referendum Council were not happy with the Victorian dialogue, and they weren't happy with the 10 people that were elected by the people to attend Uluru. So they went ahead and invited 10 extra people of their choosing, which obviously counteracted the 10 that we had put up from the grassroots level. And so getting to the Uluru meeting, it was very clear from the outset that they had the numbers, and that was because it was mainly corporations and organisations and good people, but you know, there was already an agenda set, and I believe that Uluru's statement was written well before anyone. It was probably written before we even got to Uluru. So that was disappointing. We put treaty on the table at every workshop. We were shut down by the facilitators, and that's why we walked out, because we wanted to talk about free, prior and informed consent. We questioned the information or lack of information that people had to make decisions in that room at that time. And we wanted to know why we weren't talking about treaty and the pros and cons of going into the Constitution as opposed to treaty. So all of those kinds of conversations and debates were shut down by the facilitators that they chose. And that's why we walked out, and we had to sleep in the desert that night, because we were then threatened with tribal law for walking out. And it was awful, in fact. So to not be able to close your eyes in the middle of the desert. I had my little sister in my arms because she came with me, and it was terrifying. It was traumatizing. And all I could say to my little sister at the time was, we have not done anything wrong. We have respected this country. We haven't been aggressive, and we've only fought for what our old people have always fought for, and that is to maintain our sovereign status in this country. So if we die, then so be it. Maybe we have done something wrong somewhere, but if we don't, I think we're protected by our old people. And we didn't die, but it was pretty terrifying. And then we met with senior lawmen the next morning, and they had our position interpreted to them in their language, and they formed a circle around us, or they asked us to join this circle, and we were told that we were welcome back on their country anytime, and that we'd done nothing wrong, and what the people did in threatening us was absolutely wrong, and in fact that they broke the law by threatening us. So it was difficult because people's, you know, third, fourth language is English. And so there was this real lack of understanding, and that was the most disheartening part of that whole meeting, is people just being railroaded and blinded into agreeing to something that they didn't really fully understand. And it's nice and fluffy and it looks great, and there's some beautiful words in there, don't get me wrong. There are some beautiful parts of that statement, but the danger is going into the Australian Constitution before we need to.
Well, there are some very wise words that for us all there, and especially for the Australian Parliament, federal government. It's getting on to 9:15, and Sabine has told me that the meeting will need to finish shortly because of the meeting room is needed for elsewhere. So again, just on behalf of Building Bridges, I'd like to thank very much Lydia for speaking to us tonight. It's been so informative. It's given us so much to think about, but also I think with Lydia in the Senate, it's given us a lot to hope for too, and we're very grateful for that. And thank you so much for coming to speak to us tonight in these conditions. Even with a dodgy MC like myself, but it was a first-time effort. I need to also tell you about next week, next Wednesday night, we have another speaker who's coming to us, John Mundine, a Bandjalum man who's a writer, activist and artist, and he'll be speaking to us all. Again, through the like the Zoom-like format that we've had tonight, and due to the COVID-19 virus, of course. And so that's going to be on next Wednesday in the same time, in the same place, I guess. And again, I'd like to thank you all. Thank all people for coming tonight, coming along to the night. And I should have spoken more about the role of building bridges. It's something that I've been a part of for just several years, but since I've joined, I've been introduced to so much new knowledge and so much. So I've been exposed to people who are truly committed to the reconciliation and moving ahead that this country so dearly needs. So if there are no further comments from others, I'm calling it close to the meeting. Thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next week when we're going to see John Mundine speak to
Jonathan,
us.
can I just say thank you very much? I think you did a brilliant job. And Zoom is Zoom. Everyone's used to things, going wrong. They go wrong in Parliament too. So I think you've done an incredible job. And I think that it's movements like yours and Building Bridges and all of your members, they're the movements that we need to continue. We've got the Black Lives Matter movement, we've got the climate movement, we've got the refugee movement. Like, we just get all these movements moving in the same direction, nothing's stopping us. So thank you very much for having me tonight.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.